When I first heard about the future of work in 2011, I was working as a reporter at a tech blog, a job that involved wading through a seemingly endless stream of startup pitches. This future, a seemingly endless stream of young entrepreneurs explained to me, didn't involve jobs. Nobody liked jobs. The boredom, the rigid structure, the obedience. What the world really needed were gigs. The pitch came in different versions. Some startups had created e-commerce stores, but for labor. Small businesses and Fortune 500 companies alike could sift through workers by skill and hire them on a project-by-project basis. Other startups worked more like dispatchers. Drivers, dog walkers, and errand runners could get notifications on their phones when a job became available and choose whether to either accept it or reject it. A small handful of companies had broken work into tiny tasks that took only minutes and paid only cents. They dispatched assigned online crowds of people onto work on large, tedious projects like transcribing audio tapes or checking to make sure that the grocery stores across the country remembered to put a certain brand of cola in the prime location the company had paid for. What if you don't need a boss, the founder of these startups asked me. What if you could work on projects that you wanted during the hours that you chose? What if you, single worker, were also a tiny business? In the future, it wouldn't matter how many jobs got shipped overseas or were taken by robots. We could work for our neighbors, connect with as many projects as we needed to get by, and fit them all in between our brand rehearsals, gardening, and other passion projects. It would be more than the end of unemployment. It would be the end of drudgery. So that was the pitch. And of course, it turns out that Silicon Valley, as only Silicon Valley can do, oversold it. As I reported on the workers in the gig economy over the next several years, it became apparent that startups did not invent anything new. Over the last decades, an increasing number of jobs have been detached from a single employer, whether that be through temp work, freelancing, contract work, or many part-time jobs. And the results are similar to those we've seen in the gig economy. For some, it means more freedom and autonomy. For others, it means that a safety net that was created for a full-time job no longer applies. Still others find some mix of this predicament. We tend to talk about the gig economy like it's one thing. The greatest thing ever, digital nomads working from the beach, or the worst thing ever, a way to exploit a workforce. And the truth is that it's just like there are good jobs and bad jobs, there are good gigs and bad gigs. The difference is that for freelancers, or workers that we call freelancers, the system we designed to protect workers, everything from discrimination laws to minimum wage protections, no longer apply. In my book, I look closely at 5 different gig workers' lives to illustrate different outcomes of the gig economy. As the starting point to our conversation, I'd like to tell you about 3 of them. The first person I followed, Curtis, was a recent college grad with a computer programming degree. He was incredibly bored at his job. There was never enough work to do, and he felt that he wasn't learning anything. So he quit and signed up for a website that assigned tasks to freelance web programmers. His outcome was good. He took on projects that were challenging to him, learned new skills, and enjoyed working whenever he wanted. But he was also in an income bracket that meant he was able to save a year's worth of living expenses before he quit, which meant that the week he had to spend on jury duty didn't mean that he didn't buy groceries. He lived on his savings. He bought health insurance as an individual. Another person I followed was Christy. She turned to a website called Mechanical Turk to make money after her husband lost his job driving a forklift at a factory. Mechanical Turk is a platform that pools the labor of crowd workers who do small tasks like label photos or fill out surveys in exchange for a few cents. Christy made it work. She was somehow able to cobble together a $40,000 income a few cents at a time. But it didn't work great. She set an alarm that went off any time a good task was posted and slept in her office so she wouldn't miss one. She hurt her wrist and her shoulder with all the clicking and couldn't afford to take the time off to heal or the drugs she would need to recover from the necessary surgery. A third person I followed was named Gary. He answered customer service calls for Sears, but technically he worked as a freelancer for a small business that was a contractor to a call center that was a contractor to Sears. This long chain of businesses meant he got paid little and had little connections with Sears. the person you probably thought or the company you probably thought he was working for when you got him on the phone about your broken air conditioner. His job asked him to be available a certain number of hours per week, but often there wasn't enough work to go around, so he had to take whatever shifts were available. This was different than the flexibility gained by Curtis with his programming projects. Though Gary was also being treated as a small business, his schedule was determined by when his employers needed him to work. When he suspected his immediate employer and the bizarre chain of companies that employed him had been stealing from his paycheck, he didn't say anything. As a freelancer, he could be fired for any reason, and there would be no unemployment check. I think that these experiences show how new ways of working can expand opportunity. It makes sense in a lot of ways that jobs should evolve. We are, after all, a nation of families with 2 working parents, juggling schedules, living in a digital age where nobody needs to access a physical file cabinet to be working, at a time when life expectancies are increasing enough so that those of retirement age may be looking for less work rather than no work. There's nothing inherently superior about a traditional job, but if this kind of gig work is to continue to be an important part of our workforce in the future, we also need to update our protections and safety nets to support it.
All right, so we want to talk about that. Yeah, you can have a seat here. So I think this is an interesting segue, right? Because we're talking about how do we put students in the best positions to succeed. What will the future economy look like? And if you read any of the tech magazines, Wired, Fast Company, the future of work is often synonymous with technology and automation and the gig economy. So, Sarah, what inspired you to write this book?
So really it was reporting on these startups that said they invented something new from a business perspective. I worked for business publications like Fast Company at the time I was writing this book, and thinking about what does that look like from the worker perspective, and does this vision that they have pan out.
Okay. Well, and what struck me, and you mentioned this in your reading, is that you followed real people, right? Mm-hmm. And it really serves to humanize the gig economy because, again, I took an Uber right over to the library this morning, super easy, called up the app, and instantly, I'm alerted that the driver is here. But these are real people, right, that are participating. Tell me about what surprised you as you followed Curtis and Christy and Abe, the Uber driver in Kansas City. What surprised you the most as you sort of dug into their stories?
Yeah, and you're right that I wanted to tell the story through people. There's data and professional comments from experts and kind of all that sort of research, but I really wanted to put a human face on the problem that we so often talk about generally. And I think also the point of following all those people was that it's not the same deal for everybody. It means a very different thing to lose your insurance and safety net if you're working in a job that pays you $10 an hour than it does if you're a computer programmer who makes $15,000 a month. And both of those things are true examples of what's happening. In terms of what was surprising is I kind of set out to look at technology's impact on all this and found just that this was a slow burning trend, this kind of disintegration of the traditional job that's been happening since the 70s. And so it just kind of kept getting bigger and bigger to the point where the Silicon Valley part of it is really kind of the peak of the iceberg and the most visible part of this big, slow-moving thing. Yeah.
Okay. And so as you talk to the folks that you interviewed, what were their thoughts on the gig economy? Was it all rainbows and sunshine and unicorns, or did they acknowledge some of the pitfalls? I mean, what was their perspective as they sort of were going down this journey?
Yeah, I think it depends on who they were. There's this whole corner of the gig economy universe that a lot of them make money by telling people how great it is to work in the gig economy, but they call themselves digital nomads. You can sign up for their class, and the vision that they paint is oh, there's so much freedom and flexibility, and I've been in Tahiti for the last 4 months, which is real. Some people are doing that, and it's great that they can. Mm-hmm. But then kind of starts co-opt that narrative and say like, oh, that's what we're doing with Uber drivers. And it's not the same thing. In terms of how much people acknowledge their situation, something like Uber, they consistently tell you that you're your own business, and then they change the deal constantly in a way where it's hard to understand how much money you're actually making, because maybe one week, if you drive 100 hours, you get like a bonus of $2,000, but then the next week, like, it's Thursdays at 4, you get this amount, and then they cut your wage in half the next week, and you're not really, always doing the math about like how much your car is taking, how much gas you're paying for, these kind of things. So the like understanding of exactly what they're being paid is it varies, and sometimes changes throughout like the time that they're working in that job. And then I'd say like a lot of people who are doing this just to get by, their first priority is like, can I get money now? And this really works for that. And then maybe once they get hurt, they're like, oh, I don't have any sort of workers' compensation insurance, or something like that.
Well, and you point out in your book that oftentimes we think it's young people that are the drivers of the gig economy, right? And we do know lots of students, for instance, that are Uber drivers or Postmate delivery folks. But you point out that it's actually a much bigger portion of the population than perhaps we think. Can you speak a little bit about who's participating in the gig economy?
Yeah, and I think if you look at like the Department of Labor statistics, which is really looking at only full-time freelancers, the majority of people are actually older, not younger. And I think in a lot of ways it works really well for older people to be able to work on a project-based basis, because people are living longer, and not only longer but healthier. I once heard a presentation from a guy who he'd written a book called The 100-Year Life. And he said the alternative title was The 60-Year Career, but nobody would have bought that book because it sounds like nobody would be interested in that. And so like maybe we don't want to work 9 to 5 for our whole lives, but do something kind of when older and healthier. And older people have some of the safety nets that younger people don't, in terms of like Medicare and all these things. So like it can actually work really well in retirement.
Sure. So you speak a lot about in the book about this sort of great risk shift, right? Which is, and many of our students don't think about this, many of our young people don't think about this, but when you are a full-time employee, you're afforded benefits and paid time off for vacations and sick leave, all of these things. But when you are an Uber driver or a freelance worker, you're paid for the time that you work, right? So if you are sick or if you get hurt, if you're not working, you're not getting paid. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on helping to educate and inform people about some of the risk that they will sort of inherit if they step into this economy?
Yeah, I think even for people who are full-time employees, if you look at the safety net, it's weaker than it was in 1970. We have 401k plans instead of pension plans. Often employers don't even contribute to 401k plans. The amount of health insurance that even employees that are provided a plan pay is increasing. Unemployment insurance in states is pretty much non-existent. Like there's all these trends away from kind of the social contract of 1970. And part of it is that we've created these two systems of employment. There are rules if you're an employee that give you all the labor protections and things that we decided that people should have and attach to a job for some reason. And then there are freelancers who have none of those things and are consequently like much less expensive to hire. And so because we've put like kind of corporations in charge of providing the social safety net, there's all this incentive for them to spend as less money as they can get away, or the least money as they can get away with on it, whether that be pushing kind of employees outside the walls of their firm, either through temp work or contractors, or hiring freelancers and treating them like employees.
So you have a really great story, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's managed by Q? Mm-hmm. Managed by Q. So a startup cleaning company in New York City that sort of took a different approach, right? So mm-hmm. instead of viewing workers as freelancers and trying to sort of pay as little as possible and really sort of selling themselves as platforms, as technology platforms, this company sort of said, okay, no, we're actually going to view our employees as an asset, right? Can you share a little bit about that story and
Sure.
where they are today?
So they started at the same time that a lot of companies were doing this as like kind of an Uber thing. Like you could press a button and you could sign up to get somebody to come clean your house. That person would be a freelancer. You leave them a review. And they kind of started down that road and realized that they couldn't control the quality of the cleaning in the way that they really needed to. If someone picks you up in a car and takes you from point A to point B, there's not a lot of variation in how they do that. You really hope they don't get in a car accident or their car doesn't smell. But other than that, it's easy to say, yes, that was done right. But when somebody's coming into your home, it matters a lot. Do they take their shoes off? How do they clean are they professional? Do you trust them in your home? And those are things that you really need training and management to control for, unless you're going to do really sketchy things, which these other companies did, charge them for being late, literally charge the cleaner $50 if they show up to their job late, or we won't tell you to take off your shoes, but just so you know, people who maintain their rating and don't get kicked off our platform usually take their shoes off. So instead, Managed by Q decided to try to have the best cleaners. So they hired people, they paid them well, they paid them health insurance, they gave them equity, and they really built a large and profitable business doing that. They had thousands of employees, and they made a profit. So I think the lesson there is yes, it's possible to slowly build a profitable business by treating people well. The kind of less optimistic thing is that all of their funders, they were mostly funded on venture capital, weren't interested in that part of the business as much as they were the technology that they used, that they gave to office buildings who were their customers that could order different supplies and order the cleaning. And that was really the part that the investors were interested in. So I think that raises some questions about how we fund businesses and the effect that the way that we fund businesses has on how we treat workers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting because, again, if we're talking about the macro economy and trying to make sure that people have access to quality jobs and wages that can sustain themselves and their families, it is important that people understand sort of what they're stepping into. But I think one of the things you do a good job in the book at sort of explaining is the responsibility of businesses, right? Policymakers, individuals, really of all of us, to sort of educate ourselves and understand the bigger picture and sort of what's at stake and what's happening. So I want to ask you this. I mean, if you were able to give advice, right, if you were able to go back in time and talk to Abe, who was the Uber driver, immigrant, I think, in Kansas City, what would you say to him today?
So it was an interesting case. He really wanted to be a millionaire and had fallen for all of these get rich quick schemes in the past, which Uber very much used that language when it first came to cities. It was this is the next step on the American dream. But it really is, a job and looking at it together. I think probably for the interest in this room, young people, when they're looking at what it takes to succeed and this web of kind of project-based work, one thing that is true is some people look at the gig economy and say, what a great way to build your resume. You can go out and you can do this project that demonstrates you have this skill, and all of a sudden you have experience. But only the people who are able to teach themselves will be very successful at that, because if you are working for just one project for a company and then you'll never talk to them again, they have no incentive to teach you how to do anything that you don't already know how to do. So that makes learning how to learn very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and coming back to what the previous panel was talking about, which is this sort of urgent need to make sure that we aren't creating sort of two systems, and making sure that we have, as many on-ramps to success as possible is critical. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. I guess what I want to sort of get to now is what are you seeing from your perspective? You've been in and around the tech startup industry for many, many years. What trends are on the horizon? What's coming?
Trends on the horizon. I mean, in the startup world, it's just everything. I mean, there's speakers listening to you all the time and interpreting what you say and selling it back to you. And I mean, that's just it's just enormous. All the new technologies, genes being changed to manufacture certain traits. But in terms of the gig economy, I think another thing that's happening is this isn't just an app. It's companies that you don't think of at all as startups or tech learning how to control workers this way through algorithms, delivering piecemeal work, learning that and incorporating it as a new system of management. And that can be true whether they're freelancers, whether they are people you're scheduling at a cash register, but only in the optimal amount of, optimal times for you, which might be a 2-hour shift that doesn't actually support anybody. And so I think this migration of these things into larger, more established businesses is the next thing.
Okay. And I guess we'll wrap up with, what were your biggest takeaways? What lessons did you learn from sort of this journey of reporting, and you're still doing that, and writing this book? What were the biggest takeaways for you?
I think just the need for us to address kind of the way that we educate people and the way that we legislate around kind of the workforce, which took a very long time. In the Industrial Revolution, when people came from farms and independent work and moved to cities and were working together in the same place on a shift for the first time, it took a really long time for the rest of the system to adapt to that, to prepare people and professionalize those careers, to not have child labor and not lock people in factories that might be on fire. And it took a while to establish all those rules and protections. And I think that those are now becoming outdated, and we need to think about what is the way we solve for something that's not the career of I'm going to start working at a company out of college and I'm going to be at that company when I retire, and they are going to provide for me a full pension.